Hi, everyone. My name is Andraos. Thank you for joining us for the latest Kumi Now online gathering as we discuss anti-Semitism both around the world and how it is involved in the Palestinian cause. We are joined today by Hadar Cohen.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure to be here. Should I get started or are there other introductory remarks?
I will let you to introduce yourself and begin our presentation, but we will let her speak for as long as she wants. Then I will ask her your questions from chat. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's really such an honor and pleasure to be here. My name is Hadar Cohen. I am now calling in from Los Angeles, which is where I live. I'm originally from Jerusalem, and my family's been in Jerusalem for 10 generations, so come from a very deep, old Jewish lineage in Jerusalem. And I do a lot of work around the intersections of spirituality and justice, which it seems like very aligned with people here. I teach a lot about Jewish mysticism and Judaism, and really also coming from this multi-religious lens around that, there's many paths to God, and that it's really beautiful to enrich each other with understanding different traditions and different paths. And yeah, I do a lot of justice work. I do a lot of political writing about Palestine. I've been a activist for Palestine, Jewish activist for Palestine for many years, speaking and writing specifically about Arab Jewish identity and what does that mean to really bring that to the table. Oftentimes when we think about Jews, we think about European Jews, which we'll unpack a little bit. But Jews were living all over the Middle East for thousands of years, and they're a big part of the story. So I do a lot of education and writing around that as well. So I guess I'll just leave that at that and I'll dive in. But I just want to say that I really am open to all the questions that you have. It's really beautiful to be in connection and in community. And I really believe in these spaces for learning, for political learning across communities and across the globe. So, today we'll talk about anti-Semitism, which is, especially I just recently got back to LA from Palestine, and it's been really interesting because I was also traveling a little bit through Europe, and something I've just been thinking about is, this notion of political landscapes around how my Jewish identity means something in Jerusalem, it means something different in Berlin, and it means something very different in Los Angeles. And what does that mean? That I'm still the same person, but I'm traveling through these very different political climates where there's different things that are going on. And I often teach a global audience, and, usually people are coming from their own perspectives and their own experiences. So part of what I try to do is like piece in this understanding of global understanding of anti-Semitism. And also just to say that I think that very much relates to other systems of oppression, right? Like, I think that the work of justice is in its healthiest form when we can understand that there's many different forms of systemic oppression that are working together. And when we learn about each distinct way and then learn how to build solidarity together, that's, I think, where we build greater power. So also, just to start off by highlighting, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, which is oppression against Jews, targeting Jewish people, it's really important to remember that Jews are a multiracial, multicultural people. We come from all over the world, from different races, different ethnicities, right? There's Black Jews, there's Asian Jews, there's Arab Jews, there's Latinx Jews, there's Indigenous Jews, there's white Jews, there's all types of Jews. So, oftentimes the system of anti-Semitism intersects with other forms of racial oppression. So part of, deconstructing anti-Semitism is also unpacking how is it that we think of Jews, right, as like a single entity of people and put all these labels and projections about them, but actually how to understand that we're a really multiracial group of people with highly diverse ways of practicing Judaism too. Okay, so those are a couple of introductions. I gave a class 2 days ago about anti-Semitism that was, kind of a more thorough recording, which you're welcome to access, I can share, and compiled some resources of further learning, because obviously there's a lot to say about anti-Semitism. And, with this particular community, I think it's really interesting also to see about, the dynamics that are playing out in Palestine, because there's a lot to unpack there. And oftentimes, also just want to name explicitly that we see, especially in the media and, with right-wing narratives, is that there's a lot of weaponization of anti-Semitism against Palestinians and trying to silence Palestinian voices. So a lot of my work is also like really on deconstructing that and understanding what's happening there, and how do we actually understand anti-Semitism and how we combat anti-Semitism in a way that's actually in solidarity with Palestinians and with Palestinians' right for freedom. Okay, so with all that, I'll, give a little bit of the history of anti-Semitism. And this comes from, many different thinkers, philosophers. Again, I'll share a resource list so you can take a look if you want a more, thorough lens. But, when we think about anti-Semitism, it really is one of the oldest forms of systemic oppression, right? It's thousands of years old, and it morphed in different ways across history. So it really was very much connected to the rise of the Roman Empire, right? We see something around like anti-Semitism and the rise of, right, this dominant Roman Christian empire that was trying to convert and trying to take over is very linked to anti-Semitism, right? And this way that this narrative got developed are that the Jews killed Jesus, right? This is like a classic anti-Semitic trope, that the Jews killed Jesus. Now, of course, this is a ahistorical way of looking at that time, because, Jesus himself was Jewish, his community was Jewish, right? There was different, like, yeah, Jews were involved in the killing Jesus, but also there's Jews who were involved in support. And the whole way of thinking about it, right, is ahistorical. But what we kind of got is that, right, we have this narrative that the Jews killed Jesus, right? The Jews are this like group of people who in some ways are demonic, right? Who are outside of the light of Christ, who are devil worshippers, who, need to be either converted into the light or wiped out. And this became very strong. Obviously, we see with, the rise of Christianity, there was many forced conversions like all over of Jewish people, either, forced conversions or, like massacres trying to wipe out Jewish communities, trying to exile and displace Jewish communities. So, this narrative, which is very much still alive today, especially in European anti-Semitism, and also we see in the US, although some of the dynamics in the US are a little bit different because we have a coalition with, sorry, someone asked me to speak slowly. So I'm sorry, I'll be a little bit slower. There's just a lot to cover, so I'm, excited. But yeah, in the US, we have this dynamic around whiteness, right, and white supremacy, and the way that it relates to, right, the far right nationalistic Christian fascist movement here. So we have like a very much interlocking dynamic here that is very much based, right, on anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness. So, there's particular dynamics that are happening in the US. But, going back to this European form of anti-Semitism, which was really about how, right, the Jews just can't belong here, right? The Jews really never were able to belong in Europe. There was this sense of, right, we want this like pure Christian European climate, and the Jews in some ways are threatening that. So this is one of that kind of the foundational pieces. I think from there, we get these very, really deep narratives and dynamics around, right, like who the Jews are in association to them being separate or being, separated from the world, which, ironically enough, in some ways, this is the foundation of Zionism and the rise of Zionism, right? It was like this internalized form of anti-Semitism of like, okay, we're not accepted in Europe, so how about we go isolate ourselves and not belong? Of course, so much of my work is around actually like, what does safety and solidarity look like, right? What does it look like for Jewish people to belong to the work and actually combat anti-Semitism with allies, as opposed to have this rise of Zionism? But, this is a little bit of what we're seeing there. And yeah, one thing that I want to kind of share about anti-Semitism that I think is really important, that I think that sometimes I see people missing, is that anti-Semitism sometimes looks like differently than other forms of oppression, right? When we see systemic oppression, we usually see like, okay, people are being oppressed. We can see it very clearly. They're under military occupation. They're, there's mass incarceration against Black people, right? We see it very clearly. With anti-Semitism, and actually the way that it works is that to hide the way that Jewish oppression works. So actually, a lot of the world doesn't see it, right? And it has a hard time believing that it's real, because they're like, what are you talking about? We don't see it. So I want to just unpack a little bit of that, and I'll share my screen. Can you all see this okay? Let's see if I can. Okay. So one of the dynamics that we have in anti-Semitism is this understanding that anti-Semitism is cyclical, meaning that, right, it happens in cycles and it happens in shifts. So sometimes, right, sometimes Jews are at the top and sometimes they're at the bottom, and this is part of the cycle of anti-Semitism. So, right, like, because there's this dynamic of Jewish people being the middle class people, or the middleman, usually what we have is that, it goes back far again to the Roman Empire, and especially a lot of this dynamics with money kind of came out because Jews were basically forced into positions of dealing with money. Specifically, it started out with being tax collectors. So what ended up happening is that even though, right, the Jews, they weren't running the Roman Empire, but they were the tax collectors. So they would go into these, a lot of people to collect the tax, a lot of them being poor. And then what ended up happening is that the face of, right, who's coming to collect the tax was Jewish. And then the poor people would be upset at the Jewish people, right? Because they would see them as they're the ones who have power, they're the ones who are taking the tax, but actually they're the middle class, right? They're not, they were put into that position to get to, that the greater empire was using them. So we see a lot of these different dynamics throughout history around how Jews were being used as a class so that they would be the image of oppression, but actually there's like a bigger system going on that's invisibilized. And one of the ways that it happens is that then, other marginalized communities are trained to, instead of putting their anger at the system that's happening, is actually to be angry at the Jews, right? Because that's what ends up helping the system. So here we see, this is part of April Rosenblum's book, The Past Didn't Go Anywhere, which I highly recommend, that to make the system happen, right, there's a way in which the larger system actually allows Jewish people success, right? They allow them positions of power. They allow them to be high up there, right? Because like the whole purpose of anti-Semitism is to keep Jewish faces like front and center so that people can rise up against the Jews, right? And we see this in cycles. So there's a little, just little graphic around how it works. Right. So we have this way that like Jews are isolated into one group of people, right? Either we see that through the ghettos in Europe or, just socially or occupationally being forced into certain positions. And the whole purpose is to separate them out from other marginalized groups, right? From other oppressed groups so that they can't ally together. And they're given, some privileges. Also, this is part of like try to build the resentment that other marginalized groups have on the Jews, right? And then there's this way that other oppressed groups are encouraged to channel this anger towards the Jewish people, right? The Jews are becoming the image of it. And then when there's moments of revolt, and I would also add, moments of economic crisis, I think in the US, we see this really clearly because like 50 years ago, right, there was this whole like blaming communism on the Jews. And now there's like blaming capitalism on the Jews. So it's also a lot of times also very tied to what's going on financially, right? Because we have this dynamic around like Jews and money really strongly. But then, right, so then there's a way that Jews are blamed, they're scapegoated, they're targeted, right? And that either happens intentionally from the ones who are kind of holding the power and holding the system, or it happens spontaneously at the grassroots level because, you know, we have all these marginalized folks who have been like building all this resentment, seeing Jews get privileges and them not. And then of course it puts Jews in this very, you know, awkward situation of being the middle class, right? Because it's like, okay, like they want safety on some level. So then they end up cooperating with the ruling class or ruling ideology. But then, right, then that cycle kind of continues. And, you know, part of the work that I do and a lot of the other Jewish organizers do is like, okay, how do we break this pattern? How do we actually ally ourselves with marginalized groups? How do we educate marginalized groups around anti-Semitism so that we can ally together to, you know, stop this cycle? But, you know, this is something that we see repeatedly in history, right? Specifically, we see in Spain or in Germany, right? Like right before the expulsion of Jews or right before the Holocaust, it's like, it's not like Jews were just the poor, marginalized, oppressed people. They were actually very integrated into society. We also see this actually in Iraq and Egypt as well. Like, right? Jews were very integrated into society. They were very part of it. They were in high up positions of power. They, you know, were parts of arts and culture and all these different things. They weren't, you know, necessarily like excluded. I mean, yeah, like we see like Spain and Germany are perfect examples of that. And then there was something that happened. And then there was a way in which then the Jews were just completely scapegoated. And, you know, that system, it works so well because there's a lot of like strategy and intelligence of it, right? It doesn't just like happen, right? This is like this cyclical pattern. And, you know, nowadays, I think that we're in a time where we're actually kind of seeing this again, you know, especially in the US, there's a lot of, you know, interesting dynamics that are alive here, where there's a way, right, again, that like people have this narrative of like Jews are connected to money and the Jews are taking the money from the other people, right? And kind of this dynamic that we're starting to see. So, you know, just to share that, you know, since coming back to the US and even just talking to Jewish people here, I've just been really interesting because I think most Jewish people are feeling really scared and really terrified because we know this system, we know that this cycle happens this way. And, you know, it's interesting because I think, you know, other groups, other non-Jewish groups are not necessarily familiar with this cycle. They're not familiar how to see the signs of growing anti-Semitism. So they're not necessarily prepared for, you know, what might happen. So, you know, this is part of the dynamic that I'm seeing. Just to touch base a little bit about Palestine, that, you know, I think that there's a way in which that narrative actually plays out with it as well, right? And this is a little bit maybe complex and a little nuanced to break apart, but, you know, right now throughout the globe, we're seeing the rise of fascism pretty much everywhere. But there's a way, especially, you know, with the state of Israel, that it's really becoming about the Jews and Jewish power and Jewish whatever, when really that's invisibilizing the role of Europe colonialism and US imperialism, which are both, right? Like if, you know, it's so interesting to me because I think sometimes people like forget that the Zionism, right, or the state of Israel was created really like very shortly after the Holocaust, where, you know, there was a climate of already hating Jews. Like, so why would, you know, the European nations like all of a sudden be like, okay, like we want to ally with the Jews? Like there's something there that's not making sense. Obviously, it was a wider picture, wider perspective of like, actually, we don't want the Jews in Europe. This is a great plan, right? This is a great way to ethnically cleanse the Jews from Europe and just let them have Palestine. And, you know, we don't care about the other Arabs because that's not our problem. And that's obviously part of a, you know, larger dynamic around, yeah, like Orientalism and anti-Arab racism that plays into Europe. But we see that dynamic, right? That like Zionism is really becoming like this Jewish thing, which, you know, of course we have to acknowledge that it is mostly Jewish people who are upholding it, especially in Palestine. But there's these wider forces that are actually really holding it up, that it's actually like, you know, it's not just Jews, right? It's a US imperialism, it's a Europe colonization. These are massive systems. This is why part of being in, you know, Palestinian solidarity can be it's really hard work because we're dealing with these massive systems that are connected to lots of different forms of racism, right? Both in the US and in Europe. I see, Ryan, you put in this essay that I shared with Ariella Zula. Oh, okay, sorry, you put my pieces, but I'm just gonna share one example of this way of, right, like the greater powers trying to like separate out Jews from other marginalized communities. So we see this dynamic that specifically was the French colonizing Algeria, right? Jews and Muslims were living there and Christians and they were living there together for a long time. And then what happened with French colonization is that basically overnight, all the Jews were given citizenship, right? They were all of a sudden becoming French, and the Muslims weren't. So what ended up happening, and again, this is by intelligence, it's by design, and it worked so well, and we still see that it actually worked, right? That the Jews all of a sudden became French, so it became like the colonizers, and the Muslims were resentful that the Jews got these privileges, got these rights, and right, there was a wedge that was created between Jews and Muslims. There's an essay about it in the resource list by Ariella Zulay, who's an amazing Arab Jewish writer. She talks about, like Algerian Jews and just the way that Europe played into this role of not enabling, right, like Jewish solidarity with their neighbors, and really created this rupture there. I want to pause there. Let me see if there's any closing thoughts, but I would love to really hear questions or reflections or anything that people have. Perhaps this is totally new information for you. Perhaps you already know everything. I know that there's a lot of dynamics, right, happening. I think I saw a little bit around, right, the HRA definition of anti-Semitism, right, or around labeling BDS as anti-Semitism. So, right, we have a lot of these dynamics, which are really quite intense. So I guess maybe I'll just close with this two things. One is that I think, and this is a big part of my work. Right after this, actually, the class that I'm teaching is called Jews for Palestine, which is basically organizing the Jewish community for Palestinian solidarity, which there's many, many, many Jewish activists for Palestine. But part of what happens, right, and we see this in pretty much every community, right? But right, in Jewish community, it's very hard sometimes to organize for Palestine because there's different forms of the ways different institutionalized power end up silencing us. So even though that there's a lot of Jewish people who also, resist those definitions, who resist that work, it's like, it's really hard, right? Because these systems are really big. Part of the dynamic that I'm seeing is that a lot of times, like, Jews are just isolated from other groups, other justice work. So then we lose even more power, right? Because if we were more connected to the greater collective justice, collective racial justice movements, and we were trying to fight our community from within, we would actually be able to get farther. But a lot of the times, because there's, still these stereotypes around Jews and Jews in power and Jews in wealth and all these different things, the Jewish people within the Jewish community who are trying to fight some of these ways that, the different definitions of anti-Semitism are kind of being used against Palestinian solidarity. It's like, it's hard to make moves, right? Again, this is not just a Jewish community issue. This is like a wider issue. It's a global issue at this point. And then the second to last thing I'll say before I'll open it back up to questions is that, I think that it's really important that we, especially with this conversation around Zionism and Palestine, and I think it's really important to sometimes, and different people can do it in different ways, but because I'm Jewish and I work with Jewish community, it's like, it's this notion of Jewish trauma is like really, I think a lot, what's stored in Jewish bodies right now is a lot of terror, it's a lot of fear. I mean, especially thinking about the 30s, 40s, 50s, Jewish people went through like a massive shift, right? Like, either their lands, right, especially Jews from the Arab lands, all of a sudden, you know, they were living in these lands for thousands of years. All of a sudden, their language, their tongue, their tradition were completely ruptured, completely taken away. Or in Europe, of course, with the Holocaust, and, you know, there was just so much trauma. And I always think about Hannah Arendt's essays. You know, Arendt, right around the time of the creation of the state of Israel, she sent these letters to Jewish leaders all over the world, and she said, please don't create this state. The Jews are not psychologically fit to run a state right now. We are highly traumatized. We need to process shit. And, you know, obviously they didn't listen to her, but like this essay was just like this really beautiful essay. And you know, she talks about how it's like the only possible way is to have solidarity and mutuality with Palestinians if there is immigration to Palestine. So yeah, so I think that, you know, part of this dynamic and part of this conversation is to also make space to understand, like, okay, like, you know, the Holocaust was no joke. It was a really, really intense. The Jews are still processing it, right? Sometimes it takes generations for you know, oppressed groups to really understand what just happened to them. I think really in the last like 5 years in Jewish community do I see that there's actually space to start processing what that genocide was in a trauma healing way. But obviously it's like, you know, that in some ways feels pretty urgent, or yeah, just because of everything that is happening in Palestine and just the ongoing brutality and violence that is happening, right? So there's a way in which now these things are tied. So, okay, let me pause there and open it up. I see that already people have so many beautiful questions and remarks in the chat. I know there's a lot of things. Hopefully this was supportive in some way. And yeah, happy to take any questions.
All right. Well, first, thank you very much for your talk. It was very informative and very good. So, and I encourage everyone who has a question, please to write it in the chat so that I can ask her the question. And I will start with the first question, which says, doesn't anti-Semitism exist is demonstrated in the Hebrew Bible before Jesus' time?
Say that one more time, sorry.
Doesn't anti-Semitism exist in the Hebrew Bible before Jesus' time?
So, and this is part of the dynamic that I think sometimes is difficult, and something that I see a lot is that, right, Judaism was formed in really a different, and I guess you could say the same thing about Christianity, but really Judaism was formed in a different era than what we're in, right? It was formed during the time of tribalism. And the way that, right, different tribes were at war with each other, right? This was just like this normative thing. So some of the dynamics that we see in the Hebrew Bible, of course, there's, you know, obviously we also see Pharaoh and the slavery in Egypt, but, you know, I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, it's a good question. Maybe I need to think about it more. My understanding is that with the beginning of the Roman Empire, what we started seeing is institutionalized systemic forms of anti-Semitism. So that doesn't mean that, right, like anti-Semitism wasn't real before, but the level that it started, because we have this relationship to the rise of empire, and in some ways also, right, the rise of this new age that wasn't just, that was like a move away from tribalism and into more of a, like, right, empire landscape. So we kind of see that shift.
Okay. Second question. The IHRA definition has been forced with many governments around the world. How can we push forward the Jerusalem definition, which has many prominent Jewish scholars?
Yeah.
Related, please address the issue of various definition of anti-Semitism, IHRA, Jerusalem Declaration, others.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is, you know, this is a big issue we see all over. And again, we see it differently manifesting in different places, right? There's dynamics in Germany, there's dynamics in the US, there's dynamic in the UK. How do we combat it? For me, you know, this is why I think that being in solidarity, like multi-religious, multiracial networks of solidarity are really, really important, right? Because and this is, you know, part of, I think, what I'm trying to develop further is, right, this Jewish Palestinian solidarity network, right? Because so oftentimes what I see happening, right, is that especially in the US, there's these dynamics, right? The Palestinian community is kind of course, resisting that, but then there's also an internal resistance from within the Jewish community, but there's a way that we're not fully like aligned or in relationship. So we end up kind of getting both like lost by the greater system. So for me, I feel like the way to fight against it is through building relationship and solidarity between Jews and Palestinians and, you know, other folks as well, who are aligned about this. I think, again, just to be very clear about it, I think it's super important. And the only way that these, you know, these definitions or these things can topple is if there's Jewish voices. And, you know, as you named that there's, right, Jerusalem Declaration, that's a beautiful thing that was created by many different thinkers, philosophers, writers, organizers, including many Jewish voices. So, you know, for me, I feel like the more that we get to ally in this multi-religious, multiracial way and build deeper solidarity bonds and have a clear, unified message around this, that to me is how we fight them. I think that, you know, one of the things that I'll just share that I see a lot in the Jewish community is that, you know, sometimes, you know, in kind of like the right-wing Zionist Jewish community, there's like this very strong reaction to Palestine even just being a word, right? They hear Palestine and they're immediately triggered in their system. Part of why that happens is because there was, you know, these centuries of European anti-Semitism trauma in the system, in the psyche, in the consciousness that's unprocessed. And there was a way that then the whole system worked to just blame it all on Palestinians. So, you know, if you're a traumatized person, if you haven't done your political analysis, if you're not really, you don't have the relationships with people who are different than you, the immediate reaction is like, oh, like when I hear Palestine, what comes up for me is thousands of years of trauma, right? So this is part of what we're trying to kind of undo, which is why for me, it's like, you know, doing this work, it's really kind of this two-level part of like working with Jewish community around the like unprocessed trauma that we have and separating that out from some of the dynamics that are happening in Palestine. And then also like, okay, what does that look like to build resistance and solidarity with Palestinians to, to resist some of these harmful definitions of anti-Semitism that are becoming quite pervasive.
Okay, question number 3. Is there a good book or scholarly work that compare anti-Semitism with other forms of oppression and racism, such as the Hutu-Tutsi process in Rwanda?
So yeah, there's a list of resources that I shared. My friend Ben Lorber, who is an incredible anti-Zionist Jewish activist in the US, he works at I think it's called Political Research Associates. He's coming out with a book about anti-Semitism in the next couple of months. He specifically works on monitoring the rise of white nationalism in the States. But, you know, I think it's kind of coming from a larger global perspective. I'm really excited for that to come out. So definitely stay tuned for that. But yeah, there's a list of resources that will be shared out that I compiled as well that you can take a look at and read.
Okay, next question. Can you say more about anti-Semitism and Christianism?
Yeah.
Christianism.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's a lot to say there, you know, from what I understand it around Christian Zionism, right? There's actually an interest in Jews being in Palestine, because again, it's the same tie to this notion of, right, the middle class, right? We're using Jews until we don't need them anymore, and then we're going to wipe them out. So it's very much the same thread around like, okay, like, so it's good that the Jews are in Palestine because, you know, that's related to the second coming, but once the time is right, or, you know, the Christ comes and it's no longer relevant, the Jews will be wiped out. So, you know, I think that that's, you know, like quite an intense thing. And I think that especially in, you know, work around resisting Zionism, a lot of the times Zionism is very much attached to Jewishness, right? If it's like you say you're Jewish, it's like you immediately assume that you're Zionist, or if you say Zionism, people immediately think of Jews, right? Like we have that connection super strong. But, you know, especially in the US, some of the greatest funders of Zionism come from Christian Zionism, right? And again, this is the same dynamic that happened in Europe with the creation of the state, right? It's if it wasn't aligned with a greater European colonial project, it wouldn't have happened, right? So it's the same way that it's like there's an alignment in US politics, right, around imperialism, around like, right, the rise of white nationalism here that is aligned with Christian Zionism. So this is why Israel gets so much aid every year, right? I mean, obviously we have the Zionist lobby, which has many Jewish voices in it, right? But it's not this, you know, I recently watched, maybe I can send this also, Noura Arkat, who's a Palestinian lawyer, was had this very short YouTube segment about this that was really well articulated around how yeah, right, the US is invested in Israel for its own interests, right? This is the connection here. But oftentimes what we see is that there's this narrative around, oh, Jewish power, right? The US cares about Israel because the Jews are so powerful, that's the anti-Semitic trope there that's kind of coming online. The US is interested and invested in Israel because it is also a settler colony, right? It's also, its politics are actually very much aligned. It's not because there's this great Jewish conspiracy theory, right? It's because there's this greater system that is very much related to Christian Zionism and, you know, the far right Christian movements here in the US. And this is, again, how we see that pattern that I named, right? That Jews are becoming kind of the face, when really there's a whole network and a whole thing kind of happening behind the grounds that people are not aware of. So that's why also our solidarity movements can't even go that far, because, you know, if we're spending our time blaming the Jewish community for Zionism, we're not actually understanding the systemic nature of what's going on. And then obviously we're not going to get far. And then obviously the Jewish community is going to get triggered and alienated. And so these are some of the patterns that I see that we need to disrupt. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Are you on accord with Jewish Voice for Peace?
Yeah, definitely. You know, there's a lot of very beautiful Jewish organizations. Jewish Voice for Peace is, you know, obviously a very public Jewish organization, but there's also a lot of like more underground Jewish networks of solidarity that are less visible. So yeah, Jewish Voice for Peace is a great organization. There's many others as well. And yeah, part of what also a work that I'm trying to do is like how to mobilize the Jewish community across networks, especially, you know, to understand the different dynamics in the US, in Europe, in Palestine, and how do we build more of a global understanding of and solidarity with, you know, the wider Palestinian movement.
Excellent. Critiques of contemporary anti-Semitism contend that there is a strong relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Hadar, what are your thoughts on this purported relationship?
Yeah, yeah, okay, so that's a really good question. So a couple of things. By definition, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, right? I'm an anti-Zionist and I'm Jewish and it's fine, right? So by definition, it's not. There's definitely ways in which sometimes anti-Zionism is used to perpetuate anti-Semitism. You know, I just had a Shabbat here last weekend, and I had a Palestinian friend come and he asked, you know, it was a bunch of Palestinians and anti-Zionist Jews. It was really beautiful. But he's like, do you ever get like these really, you know, weird DMs? He sometimes gets, you know, he's active on social media. So sometimes he gets these DMs where it's like, it's usually from, you know, non-Jewish, non-Palestinian Europeans that are like, free Palestine, kill the Jews. And he's like, whoa, what? Like, yeah, free Palestine, but like not kill the Jews. So there's definitely this, especially I see this coming a lot from in the European community, right, where there's a desire to ally with Palestinians, but sometimes it's kind of being as a way to kind of bond over hating the Jews together. I mean, this is something that I've heard from many Palestinians in Europe, you know, in Berlin as well, where it's just like, there's this dynamic of like, yeah, we hate Jews too, like, let's collaborate. So yeah, you know, it's a very tough dynamic to unpack. And then a lot of Palestinians have to, you know, do this education work around like, that's actually not aligned with the Free Palestine movement. So yeah, so I think that there's that dynamic there. I think that there's also this other dynamic, right? And I think that perhaps this is where you might have heard this, right, around this relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism being the same thing. I think it kind of relates to this thing of Jewish trauma that I mentioned before, is that I think that for some Jews who have not processed, right, the very age-old traumas, and who've not done political education work and have been insulated in their own particular communities, when they hear you know, in Jewish community, the way that you're trained about Zionism is that Zionism is a Jewish liberation movement. That's been very kind of like honed in to Jewish psyche. So when someone comes and tells you they're anti-Zionist, what sometimes people hear is that they're anti-Jewish, that they're anti-Jewish people having a liberation movement. Now, of course, that's not what's happening, but because, right, there's that trauma there, there's the trauma response that comes along online very fast around like, wow, these people hate me, they don't want Jews to be alive, right? Like that's a very strong trauma response that's still there. And there's a lack of political education because there's been a lot of propaganda instilled into the Jewish community around Zionism. Then sometimes, you know, people are not able to make that distinction. You know, this, for me personally, I'll share, this is part of why, you know, I identify as an anti-Zionist, but I often use different languaging, right? Especially with this class that I'm teaching. I called it Jews for Palestine, because I think then it just gets clearer. It's like, okay, we support Palestinian liberation, and now we can talk about what that means. And I think anti-Zionism sometimes has like this, yeah, just connected to a trauma response that comes up that is more emotional than actual, like, right, intellectual, political. And yeah, with working with the Jewish community for years, it's like, I see this, that, you know, many of them are in support of Palestinian liberation and Palestinian solidarity, but there's a really big emotional response, right, that still needs to be worked out with. So this is why sometimes, you know, it's like, if you show people the facts of what's going on, right? Like on the ground, it's like very clear what's going on, and especially with the recent Israeli elections. It's like we see, okay, Israel like is a fascist state, it's a Jewish supremacy state, it's apartheid. Like it's very clear. The facts are there, the reality is there. Like it's really undisputable. But what ends up happening, right? Trauma, it distorts the ability to see reality clearly, right? So you can forever just put the reality in someone's face. But if they're traumatized, they're not going to be able to see it clearly. So this is why, again, for me, like that trauma work feels really important. And some of the dynamic that I see where we kind of get stuck or looped a little bit is, right, that we have like, right, activists for Palestine kind of coming to the Jewish community being like, free Palestine, free Palestine, free Palestine. What ends up doing is that sometimes, right, like presses or pressures their trauma, right, because they hear Palestine and they've been conditioned to associate Palestine with anti-Semitism and, right, this whole kind of network. So then their sense of belonging and safety is really like, you know, their nervous system are dysregulated. And then, you know, if there are some like ways of talking about like, oh, the Jews in power, the Jews are this, then they easily point to that and they're like, see, the world hates us, the world doesn't like us, this is why we need to isolate, this is why we need our own country, this is why we need to military defend ourselves, right? And then that pattern kind of continues, and the activists are like, free Palestine, and you know, so it's a kind of a loop that yeah, needs to be broken, needs to be dismantled. I don't believe that the majority of, I mean, I guess the dynamics in on the ground in Israel are quite different with the Jewish community, but you know, definitely in the US community. And the statistic that came out a couple of years ago was that 25% of American Jews would call Israel an apartheid state. And that's a pretty high number considering that there's intense amount of silencing in the Jewish community around it. So 25% are actually the ones who are publicly able to say that. I would imagine that there's at least twice that amount who think that and feel scared to say that publicly. So, yeah.
Okay, so basically 3 people have asked the same question. Can Palestinians and Jewish Israelis be in government together? What are your thoughts about one state versus 2 state? Can Israel-Palestine happen under one government with this same name?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, one thing as I'll share is that, and again, this is coming from my personal perspective. Obviously, there's many different initiatives, many different thinkers who are thinking about this. The 2-state solution, in my mind, right, is no longer viable. Israel pretty much completely destroyed that option with the increasing of settlements, and yeah, that's not really on the table anymore. But also I think that, right, it's like, I really think that the priority needs to be to dismantling apartheid, right? And of course, also ending the occupation related things. Like, this is where the focus needs to be. I think that sometimes, especially in Palestinian activism space, we get so drowned out in this like hypothetical around like what can be, what will be, like, you know, and I think that we need to kind of move away from just having intellectual conversation about what the future might look like and actually understanding the reality on the ground, which is that it's incredibly violent, incredibly brutal. And it is coming from this, you know, the state of Israel just like systemically and brutally oppressing Palestinians. So that needs to be the first, you know, kind of point. But yeah, I mean, I think that I don't like the word coexistence because it's shared society, I guess now is the language people are using, right? Of course, I believe that Palestinians belong in Palestine. I believe that Jews also deserve to live in safety as well. I don't personally think that it needs to be the state of Israel. I think that it's okay to dismantle it. I think what we've seen from the beginning of the creation of the state, that it has been incredibly violent, right? There's a huge process of reparations, of reconciliation that needs to happen. There's Palestinian right of return that we need, right? There's so many different issues. And I think that, you know, sometimes, especially we get into this narrative, especially in a more mainstream conversation around like 2 sides, both sides are suffering. But the truth is that it's very clear that there's, you know, colonizing power. I mean, especially now, it's like really just like full on fascism. So I don't think it's really going to be solved by just, you know, this 2-state, Israel can have this, Palestine can have this, because we're seeing very clearly Israel is not interested in a 2-state solution. I don't believe it ever was interested in that. And I think that for me, you know, this is something that actually I'm going to be a contributing editor to the New Arab. I saw someone was asking if I'm Arab. I am also Arab. My family comes from all over the Middle East, from Jerusalem, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. But I think that we need to change up the conversation a little bit between Israel and Palestine to Jews and Palestine, actually. And I think that there's a new era that's coming around Jewish and Palestinian resistance together, around Jewish people who are very committed to Palestinians living in safety and freedom in Palestine and dismantling the apartheid regime together. So, you know, as long as the conversation is trying to bring Israelis who support the Israeli state as it's manifesting with Palestinians for dialogue work, like that's not going to move us anywhere. But if it's Jews coming from this understanding of like, we need to dismantle the state together, then I think we can actually get somewhere. And thank God that I think is happening. You know, there's different, both on the ground and international initiatives, you know, most of them are underground, but I think that they're slowly going to become more and more visible.
Sorry, once again. A friend always reminds me that Arabs are Semites as well, and would like to see the term anti-Semitism broadened to include anti-Arab discrimination. Your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a whole hour class. So 2 thoughts. One is that, and especially now in the US, I don't know if people have been keeping up with this, right? We see kind of this increase of the Black Hebrew Israelite narrative, right, around Christian Black community being like, we're the real Jews and the other Jews are fake Jews. So this way, and I've seen different Jewish people kind of resisting this way that, sometimes because Arabs are like, Semite is all of us, like, why is anti-Semitism not about all of us? But I think that it is very important that we talk about specific ways of anti-Jewish oppression, because we see these different ways of co-option of identity that are really not okay, not acceptable, right? So at least now in the US, right, where the Jewish community is kind of like dealing with this dynamic around like, okay, how do we deal with Christian Black community when they're coming and they're telling us we're the real Jews because we were actually enslaved, and the Jews who are coming fleeing the Holocaust were fake Jews, right? It's a pretty intense dynamic to unwind. And I think that sometimes there's parallels to how, when Arabs are like, we're Semites too, and it's like, that's true, but I think that there is also an important way to talk about particular Jewish oppression, which is why the term anti-Semitism, which was coined by, non-Jewish European guys, actually sometimes not helpful. Sometimes some of my teachers try to move away from anti-Semitism into talking about anti-Jewish oppression. That just makes it a little bit more clear. But, that hasn't really caught on yet. People think of anti-Semitism still. So, but one thing that I will say about that, and this has come from being in Europe in this last summer, which I feel like I saw really clearly, right, is this conversation about, Orientalism and anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, too. Of course, these are all very connected things. I think one of the dynamics, and hopefully I'll have an essay about this coming out soon, is when we think about Orientalism, right, we think Orientalism, Edward Said, like, right, against Arabs, against Palestinians, against Muslims, but actually, right, Orientalism originated around Jewishness in Europe, right? It's thousands of years ago, right? When the Jews, Orientalism was this way of like thinking of the Jews, right? Of these backwards people, the people who didn't accept Jesus, as the ones who held on to this ancient biblical thing, right? That was actually so much of how Orientalism was developed in Europe. And then, right, with the rise of Islam, it was also, different dynamics around the Arab world that was happening. Orientalism actually became more about Arabness. And this way. So there's a lot of connections there that need to be articulated around, anti-Jewishness, anti-Arabness, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinianness, right? They're actually coming in a very connected way. But again, as we saw, like colonialism actually uses this divide and conquer strategy, right? Even just the languaging of like Jews versus Arabs, which is so strong from like the Israeli-Palestinian dynamics, right? It's Jews versus Arabs. So I talk a lot about it, really just erases Arab Jews. It doesn't make any sense as it both takes Jews into this one category and then takes all of Arabs into this one category, and then it positions them as enemies, which is very far from actually the systemic dynamics that are going on. So anyways, that's just a little glimpse of that answer. I definitely think that there, especially in the West, in the US and in Europe, anti-Arab racism is really not understood. And I think that there needs to be more content, more education around that. But I also think that, anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish oppression also needs to have its own place as well.
So shall we wrap it up?
Yeah, sure, let's do it.
Okay, because I don't know, because you need to leave, you said, right, at 7?
Yeah, I do, sadly. This is really beautiful. I've been really enjoying all your questions, and hopefully
because there are a ton more questions, but sorry we couldn't ask them for the time and everything. So thank you everyone for joining us today. A link to a video of this gathering along with all the links shared today will be available on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube in a day or so. It will be shared in the next newsletter. You can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure you receive them. Would greatly appreciate it if you share this session with your friends and colleagues, as well as information on our future webinars. I would like to thank everyone that participated in this discussion today. Thank you, Hadar, and And for next week, we look at children's rights.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I just want to say really quickly that if you want the longer recording of the anti-Semitism class I taught a couple of days ago, it's an hour and a half. You can, it's signed up as a class, but I just put the link on there. If you just want the recording, you can purchase it online as well.
Great, thank you very much. So I would like to be reminded of the online, if you'd like to be reminded of the online gathering an hour before they begin, you can register for email reminders at kuminow.com/online using this form at the bottom of the page. Thank you very much.